Thank you for coming today. You make me feel good that you come and for a lunch and associate with people who think they have a passion about reserves and resource evaluation, and so that's what's driven me for a long time. One of these days we're going to get it right. Maybe we're not there yet, but let me start with a few thank yous, particularly SPE for this session here, for the SPE Foundation that makes the Distinguished Lecture Program possible. If you are about to become a distinguished lecturer for this next series, raise your hand. Oh, you're on the tour again? If you have been a distinguished lecturer already, stand up, would you? I want you to recognize these folks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This has been a distinct privilege for me to represent SPE in taking the word to the various sections around the world. I feel good about it. I've met with so many sections that are just as passionate about what they do as you are about your job. I met a lot of students at a lot of the places that I visited with. I'm encouraged by the young people that I meet. The problem is there are just not enough of them. But they attended the sessions, they ask a lot of questions. I'm encouraged by young students all over the place. I spoke at 2 or 3 college campuses, visited several of them, and encouraged by the faculty and others who provide their time worldwide to teach people about petroleum engineering, the geosciences, other forms of engineering. We need all of those talents in what we do. This, it happens to be the left click. I am also appreciative of Ryder Scott Company for the 38 years I worked there, but also for sponsoring part of the expenses of my trip. They made it possible for me to move from coach up to business class for all of these travels, and so Mike, take that back home and let the folks at Ryder Scott know that that's appreciative. I understand the new Distinguished Lecturer Program for travel more than 8 hours, is that right, will be paid for by the Foundation Board for coach travel, unless you have a sponsor that would pick that up, and SPE Foundation would appreciate that. And so that's one of the other things that I wanted to mention. Also, this lady right over here with a camera in her left hand, Donna Newcomb, has been the best friend I've had over the last 9 months. Stand up, Donna. You did a super job in my travels. She made a lot of plane reservations for me. Everything worked very well. She got the sections, all the other parts of the world, to have someone meet me at the airplane. I don't think she got that out of a sense of cooperation. I think she did it with extortion and threats and so forth, but it worked. There was somebody there every time I got off of a plane in a strange land, and thank you for that, and thank you for what you do for SPE. Okay. This is the tour schedule I was on, and I'm not about to think you could read that, but it occupied a lot of my time from almost a year ago up until now. You'll think, well, I gave the same presentation, but it's not. It's changed almost every place because we have moving developments within the SPE, the SEC, so I try to update it a little bit. But it's been a pretty interesting place, to starting out in Grayville, Illinois. I heard you mention that, and winding up in Ataral, Kazakhstan. But wonderful people everywhere I went, and I was so graciously treated. So if you ever get an opportunity to serve as a distinguished lecturer, say yes. It's important. Don't do it just for the society. Do it for yourself. It's very rewarding. This presentation today is just the SPE story. There are many other people who have been involved in reserves, estimation, definitions, Russia, South America, China, other places. I don't have the time nor the ability to tell all that story, but this is the SPE story. Notable to that, before SPE got involved, was our own API within the U.S. And so my first tracking of reserve definitions in the U.S. goes back to the API in the mid-1930s. Our role began 46 years ago. You know, the SPE is only 51 years old as an autonomous society. And the board at that time appointed a 12-man committee. I'm supposed to say 12-person committee, but it was a 12-man committee for a particular purpose, special committee on definitions of proved reserves for property evaluation. Not for regulatory reporting, not for reservoir management, not for guidance, for one particular purpose. You'll see who was on the committee. 2 oil companies, a gas pipeline company, a college professor, banks, insurance companies, and consultants. Why insurance companies? That's where the money was. That's where people went to borrow money. You may still do that through some of the equity funds and in ways that you might not know about. I just had to show you this list of who was on that committee. J.J. Arps was the consultant, and he chaired this committee. These names, that I'll flash them here before you pretty quickly, are names that some of you will recognize. This was truly a blue ribbon committee of names. Morris Muscat pops out there. And these people had a job to come up with a document representing proved reserves in the U.S. You would think these people could go off in a corner in an afternoon and do that, wouldn't you think? I mean, these were some of the best minds we had. 3 years later, these 12 people came up with a draft, and they brought it to the board. It took them 3 years. They brought it to the board. The board voted on it in June of 1965. API was still involved kind of as an observer. They said, we like this. The American Gas Association was involved kind of as an observer, and they said, we don't like it. The vote was 7 yes, 3 no, and 2 abstained. I tell you this just for you, some of you younger people, to realize how contentious this issue of definitions is to us practitioners. I heard a fellow in Canada about 2 years ago at a presentation that John Etherington was making. John, are you here? John's one of the primary authors of the new PRMS, and I heard him say that he heard a person in Canada said, I'd sooner use another man's toothbrush than his reserves definitions. I'm not there yet, but it is a contentious issue. A lot has happened since then. 1987, the Oil and Gas Reserves Committee, as it came to be known by then, finally got beyond the proved reserve limitation in the U.S. and added the categories of probable and possible. Now, you'll notice a little note there, rejected the probabilistic method. Now, how in the world could somebody reject a mathematical procedure? Well, we did. That I think some people that served at that time might look back upon and see how Americanistic North American this was, and how that was a mistake at the time. But nonetheless, that's a part of our history, and we deal with it. 1997, 10 years later, the World Petroleum Council, Congress at that time, got involved enough with the SPE Reserves Committee that they convinced us that we really need to be a little bit more open in our global view. And they led us into a process where we began to endorse a little more of the science that had been used around the world in probabilistic assessment. That's not that long ago that we finally moved into that, and away from just a North American mindset into a more global mindset. 3 years after that, we finally invited the AAPG friends to come under the WPC SPE tent and add their insights into developing a set of resource definitions. Now, we were not leaders in this. SPE was not leaders in this. The Norwegians, particularly, the National Petroleum Directorate, was way ahead of us in this. So were the Russians and perhaps many other parts of the country. But here we are. This is the SPE story. We finally caught up in some of those areas. The resource definitions were instituted at that time. Jim Ross with Gaffney Klein at the time was really instrumental in doing some of that. And we began to get some global recognition because we were kind of joining the rest of the world. The most recent Reserves Committee did more than just the reserves that you may become familiar with. They developed a mapping of I think there are 7 or 8 different different reserves definitions that are used around the world. You'll see these different venues here. Which one of these is better? Well, I don't think that's for me to say. They all serve a purpose in the venues that they're in. But the SPE committee did quite a bit of work in at least mapping, comparing these various definitions so that you'll have a better understanding if you even care about things like this. All this is available on the SPE website. And for those consultants who do get involved in international work, it's really nice to have a better understanding of the purposes of reserve definitions that are used in other parts of the world. The Russians are very pleased with the work they've done. They've done some very good work over time. So have the Chinese and others. But again, all of this is a part of what you can find on the SPE website. Who is the Oil and Gas Reserves Committee? Typically, when I joined, and how many of you have ever served on the Oil and Gas Reserves Committee? Raise your hand. Well, there's a few. Maybe those are admissions, but thank you for that. For years, it was 3 people were added by the incoming SPE president. They served for 3 years, rotated off, so there were 9 people there, plus some observers. With Bill Cobb coming on, he thought we needed more people on there, and so he's beginning to add to that. So the committee is somewhat bigger than just the 9 that was traditionally there. I think we have about 12 people now. When I joined the committee a long time ago, we thought it was an international committee. We had a Canadian and we had somebody from England, and we thought, well, we're international now. Well, looking back, I think it's kind of foolish for us to even have thought that at the time. But here we are. This is the history. But there are at least 10 different countries, not represented necessarily, but our people that live in 10 different countries are involved in this. So I think we are getting to where we can call it an international committee at this point. And then there are observers that are not active participants on the committee, but are sent by different organizations. John Wood is sitting right here in front of me with EIA, part of the DOE. John, how long have you been on that as an observer? 10 years? At least, he said. So, but he's been there a number of years. I serve as a SPE observer at the same time. We've got the International Accounting Standards Board and the SCG are more recent additions. And you'll say, what about the SEC? Wouldn't they be a good organization to have an observer? We invited them. They declined. The engineers would have loved to have participated, but they have handlers that did not allow them to associate with us. And I understand that. In early 2007, when I started this presentation, it was just a little while ago. Now it's a year and a half ago. The new SPE definitions were released. SPE, WPC, AAPG, SPEE, and it's come to be known now as PRMS, Petroleum Resource Management System. That's the acronym we used. A little bit of a secret is, at one time we thought we would shorten all of this as a member of the committee, and we'd call it a reserves management system. Well, let's just call it SPE, Reserves Management System. But if you look at the acronym, that's SPERMS. Think about it. So some of our more learned people said, we can't do that. So someone, and I won't call the name, said, why don't we call it Petroleum Resource Management System? And so we did. So that's the derivation of the PRMS. Aren't you glad you're not having to work with that other acronym? But it was approved by the SPE Board in Cairo, part of an internationalization of this, and was presented, disclosed in Muscat, Oman the next day. I think I have a Muscat a friend here today, sitting right back there. Yes. How was this process, if I were from Canada, I'd call it a process. How was this process accomplished? There was about 3 years of work, but at the end of the day, the Reserves Committee came up with the original draft, sent it to the board. The board said, let's send it out to the industry. If you're an SPE member, you got a copy of it. It was in JPT. More than 100 different companies outside of SPE members were informed. We had a 100-day draft period. Came back to the OGRC, went to the SPE board, and was finally approved. I think it was disclosed widely enough for almost anyone to have a voice in this. And many of you did have voices in this, and you were heard. Your companies were heard, NOCs were heard, IOCs, regulators, banks, all sorts of people participated in. Doesn't mean it was unanimous, but we've come to a consensus agreement that this is the way to go. What's included in the backbone of this is the resource and reserves definitions, which is the heart of it. There's a glossary, a reserves and resource glossary, and you'll say, well, we all know what those terms mean. I bet I could find someone here that disagree with me about one of the particular words that we use all the time. So we've tried to put that in a form where we can have a uniform definition and understanding of what some of these words mean. This is an evergreen document. It continues to get updated and revised, but it's a part of the PRMS package. The definitions mapping project that I spoke of, it's all part of the PRMS package. And then the applications guidelines. This is something that practitioners really would like to have. You'd say, well, what do I do with all of this? Are there some examples? Are there some guidance from SPE and some of the other organizations about how to use this? Well, there's a committee, the Applications Guidelines Committee. We're meeting this afternoon. There's a 2:30 meeting to further that discussion along. When will the applications document be ready? It's a while yet. But we're doing this with volunteer workers, and you know how that works. But we've got the right people, I think, aligned with the right projects to move forward, and so it will happen, and it will be a good piece of work. We may borrow some from what some of the Canadians have already done in some of their work in developing their new reserves and reporting system. What's new in the definitions? The committee thought we ought to focus on it being a project-based system. That means different things to different people. In parts of the U.S., a project may be a single well because of ownership limitations. Could be a group of wells. In a more global setting, it may be something larger than that. It may be a reservoir, maybe a field, maybe multiple fields in a project. I think some of the things that we're doing in shale gas, shale oil, very much fit the project description rather than the well by well way we've done it in the U.S. For a long period of time. We'll still do it the way that the ownership dictates, but with the ownership as diverse as it is typically in the U.S., the project may be a well or a lease or a group of wells. I'll have a chart in just a moment, but we'll talk a little bit more about classifications of resources moving up from undiscovered all the way through reserves and cumulative production for that matter, with then the element of uncertainty kind of left to right on the chart that I'll show you, having to do with the uncertainty of recovery, proved, probable, possible, or some permutation of that. Prices and cost, at least in the PRMS, the basic assumption is that you'll use a cost and price structure based upon forecast conditions, not historical. The 1997 definitions suggested you use something historical. The committee at this point suggests you use something forecast, pretty much as the Canadians do, but with some documentation as to why and how this came to be. Recognition of unconventional resources. Thank goodness we finally caught up with that, because I think half the gas production in North America comes from what we at one time called unconventional resources, but at least recognizing those with some guidance about how we go about assessing resources and reserves. All of us are still struggling with some of these non-conventional resources about how we do that. I think some of us are having to unlearn some of the things that we learned in the more permeable and porous reservoirs. And then there's an expanded section on analogs. We all use analogs. It's one of our best tools that we have in reserves and resource assessments, but it's one of our, it's awfully dangerous as it's being misused. So I submit to you that there's some guidance there in the reserve definitions on analogs I think you'll find useful. And then guidance on reserves or a resource booking point, a reference point. At what point do you book reserves? Is it at the wellhead, as it might be here in Colorado, or is it the tailgate of a plant, inlet to a plant, tailgate of a plant? There's some good guidance in the definitions that I think helps us to better understand where that is. You as an engineer may not be able to make that determination. It may be with your attorneys and your accountants that help make that determination where the appropriate reference point is for booking of reserves. And with my years of experience at Ryder Scott, it gets very complicated in some parts of the world as to where that point is. But there's some guidance in the PRMS. This chart that I spoke to you about looks a lot like what the NPDs had for a long time. But as you go vertical on the scale, you go from the total oil or total hydrocarbons in place. Now this chart, would that apply to the whole world? Could. Could it apply to Colorado? Yep. Could it apply to a company, an area, a county, or yes, it could. But it's still a system for a defined unit. The total hydrocarbons in place, some of that's unrecovered, that you'll see down in the blue. As you go through a discovery process, it moves up into something you've discovered. It may be contingent for a time. It's not economic. You don't know how to commercialize it. But then you move up to the scale. Once you reach that point of commerciality, it moves into reserves. And then reading left to right, reserves, as most of you know, proved. We have a good ongoing discussion. Does that mean P90? Does that mean reasonable certainty? And we don't have enough time to even start talking about that here today. But I'll know it when I see it. But this is the chart. Now, putting it together a little bit by project maturity, after you get through the discovery criteria, there's something in the PRMS about what constitutes a discovery. You'll think, well, I know what that is. Well, we might argue sometimes. Is a core and a log, is that enough for a discovery? Do you need flow to the surface? Anyway, there's some guidance in the PRMS, and I think it's helpful for us as practitioners to come to a common meaning as to what that means. There is and I'll try to get to here. See this, as you move up from play, lead, prospect, we generally know what those mean. Development not viable, development unclarified, development pending. There's a line there that says justified for development. The committee spent a lot of time working on this little barrier here. In the U.S., and especially with the SEC, that justified for development is not going to cut it. They want it to be assured, committed for development. Maybe by your corporation, your company's board of directors. Not just justified for development. What does justified for development mean? I think if you'll read through the PRMS, it says, we see no impediments to prevent this project from moving into commerciality. That's a little soft, ladies and gentlemen. It's not terms I would have chosen as a reserves practitioner, but this was not just me, not just other folks sitting around this room. This was the people from all over the world, and that's where we're coming to. It's a little soft spot, I think, but I think each company will decide themselves how they treat this. But in the U.S., I think the SEC will have some thoughts about justified for development. They've seen a lot of things justified for development that never made it. There's two kinds of PUDs in the United States, approved undeveloped locations. There are two kinds. Those are the kinds you can't wait to drill, and those that you dare not drill. That's not part of the presentation. but they're there. But anyway, this moves all the way on up to approved for development and on production, and it's a fairly easily understandable scheme. But as you move toward commerciality, and then obviously production is money in the bank. Moving on, other recent action from SPE. Recent is a little bit out of date now, as this is the tail end of this presentation schedule. The board approved on the same day that PRMS was approved a new section or a new document called Auditing Standards. How many of you are familiar with those auditing standards? Raise your hand. Okay. I think it's a good piece of work. I think I know it's updated something that was written in the mid-70s, updated in the early 2000s, but it contains a lot more information that's really consistent more with the way the accounting world operates today, Sarbanes-Oxley, some things like that. Plus it sets forth some what I believe are standards, guidelines for who's qualified to be a reserves estimator and a reserves auditor. I commend that to you. It's available off the website. There's some good guidance in there, I think, for most of us who are or have been involved in reserves estimating. In the middle there, you'll see that SPE joined with some sister organizations to form a joint committee on reserves evaluator training, JCORET. This is something that a number of us have worked on for a while. We have 3 members from each of the sponsors. We've got a number of large companies involved. Shell has been involved. ExxonMobil has been involved. Devon is involved. Some of the smaller companies have been involved, a number of consultants, trying to put together training courses for people who are employed as reserves estimators or auditors. And you'll say, well, I work for a big company and we have excellent training programs. I've been trained very well. Why would you do this? Especially after having traveled around different parts of the world, there are many, many companies and many, many individuals that simply don't offer training for their employees. It's kind of catches you best can. And you might work for a company that says, okay, I'll sponsor you for a week in London, $2,500, and you get some training there. That's not available to very many people around the world. My view is, and I guess I'll be quoted on this, that most of the world's oil reserves are estimated by underqualified people. You'll say that sounds shocking, and how dare I say that? I didn't say unqualified, I said underqualified. This JCORET is an opportunity to put together, through SPE, opportunities for people, young engineers, geologists, not necessarily young, but people who are just getting exposed to this, to get some quality industry level recommended practices training. And you'll say, well, that sounds pretty ambitious for you to say that, almost arrogant, and I don't mean it that way, but after 38 years with Ryder Scott, I've seen a lot of things that that lacks the standards that we should, and it's not these folks' fault that they don't have the training. We have an obligation, I think, to provide that. We're training in definitions. That's a part of it. John Etherington is already out with an approved course teaching these definitions in many places around the world. Technical recommended practices and ethics training. That depends on where you are in the world as to what that means. A few comments about the US SEC. It is, or I guess it has been up until now, the most powerful regulatory body in the world. But we'll see with what's happening on Wall Street. Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 really changed the landscape for many of your companies that are publicly owned about how accounting is done. The word oil and gas is not contained in Sarbanes-Oxley. The words reserves is not contained in Sarbanes-Oxley. But it's really written all over it. It has to do with transparent, competent reporting of information that's useful to a shareholder. That can be revenues, expenses, rates of return, all those things. But reserves quantity, reserves evaluations are also bits of information that are important to a shareholder. So it's waked a lot of companies up about maybe we need to tighten up our reserves estimating process. Maybe we even need to develop a process. And it's also focused a little bit on people like us and me that maybe we as evaluators, maybe we need to make for sure we're qualified as well. There are civil and criminal penalties that can be awarded to people who are not properly following Sarbanes-Oxley guidelines if you do it in a fraudulent way. But I still think as individual evaluators, we have a personal responsibility as professionals to be able to perform to the maximum of our ability. So I think Sarbanes has waked some of us up a little bit if we were sleeping a little bit, but SEC is very much a part of that. Indications of progress was in the SEC was about a year ago when they hired John Lee from Texas A&M. I'm not going to ask you to show hands about who knows who John Lee is. The SEC finally decided that they needed an academic petroleum engineering fellow. They had legal fellows in their legal and accounting fellows, but they never had anybody from our side of the world. and they picked John Lee. I imagine several of you here recommended John, as I did. Were there other people who would have qualified? Yes. I don't think many people would have been much better than John, but he went up. He gave a year out of his academic life at Texas A&M. I look upon this as a year of public service for Dr. Lee, and I think we all ought to, when you see him, tell him how much you appreciate him leaving that fine job he had there on the campus to go to Washington and live among these other people and help guide them. Thank you, Gary. So give him a pat on the back when next you see him and thank him for this, because it made a difference. Because he had not been there very long until December 11th of that same year, the SEC issued an invitation for public comments about a concept release that they were sending out to the public about possible reserve reporting changes. John Lee was at the heart of all of this. He might have been the catalyst, as we think of it, to be a part of a process without being consumed himself, hopefully, to get this started. And so, but he got the ball rolling. Comments were due last February. Many of you worked for companies that filed comments at that time. The SEC took those in mind, took those to heart, and issued a proposed set of rules changes just this last June. Many of you work for companies that responded to that with your industry comments just a few days ago. I think the deadline was September the 8th instead of September the 6th as shown on this slide. I looked on the SEC website this morning, and there was about 80 responses that come from people like you and others to what we think should be done. The SEC is very open for comments. They will take these comments and will chew on them for a while through their process. My guess is it'll be after the first of the year before we hear something from them. But it will be a new set of rules and guidelines that I believe will be put into force at the end of the year 2009. That's more of my opinion than it is necessarily a fact. My best guess of the outcome, this is the part I wish were not recorded, but it will be. But so you have a chance to prove me wrong. I believe that the SEC is going to adopt still a constant price, but it will be based on a 12-month average period and not the December 31 price that people objected so violently to in calculating reserves and cash flows at the end of the year. If we get a 12-month trailing price by October, at least you'll just have to work your reserves one time because you'll know what the prices are and not have to wait till after January. One of the little glitches in the new set of definitions, new set of regulations are that they will still use the December 31 price for the ceiling test and the October average price for reserves. I think that's got to be rectified, folks. I can't imagine two reporting, but that's something that will have to change. Surely they'll come to a common price for consistent reporting. I do believe that then management will also have an opportunity to present its forward-looking case with its own internal pricing forecast. Let's just call it a management case. Never have we done that before. I've seen some managements try that. At least one company got his hand slapped for doing that. But I think it will at least be possible for a company to put forward its own management's forecast. I believe that you'll also, if you're a filer, be able to file proved reserves only, if that's your choice. And I think that'll be the choice of a lot of reporting companies. You'll have the opportunity to report P2, P3 reserves, some combination thereof, if you choose to, with the appropriate disclosures. The one offset rule that many of you have lived with in the U.S. Has really aggravated and upset a lot of people. That yes, you can have proved undeveloped location, but no more than one offset from a commercial wellbore. People outside of North America didn't know what we were talking about. It didn't make any sense in parts of the world. But I believe that guidance will be relaxed as long as, almost under PRMS guidelines, as long as the evaluator has adequate information and in his or her opinion you can justify a larger recovery area, drainage area, or area of influence. Now, you probably need to get your guns loaded because you may be questioned about that. This is also an area that I think some of us in the consulting world will see a lot of abuse too. How many counties can you go in coal seams and shales? So it's going to be a tough area to work with and to work for, but I think you'll see a relaxation of that. And then the down dip limit to the lowest known gas, the lowest known hydrocarbons, will be relaxed if we can use pressure gradient. That's something that really grinded on some people that here we have good data and can't use it. So I think you're seeing a relaxation, moving more to moving away from a rules-based system into more of a principle-based system. At least that's what I believe that they're telling us that we're going to. And then, I'll just use mine crude here, SEC will finally recognize that crude oil from wherever it comes from can be called reserves, and that's not set well with a lot of producing companies up until now. These are just my guesses of things that will happen. There'll be a lot more things that will happen that much more granularity than what you see here. Those of you who work for large companies in the reserve section, it's going to be a lot more work to do. The accountants are going to have a lot more work to do. Be careful what you ask for. You ask for the opportunity to report more than proved, you've got it. A lot more probably vintaging of PUDs. How long have they been on your books? A lot of bookkeeping, a lot of reconciliation from one year to the next. So get ready to staff up and beef up your departments and or hire more consultants because it's going to be a lot of work. And something near and dear to me, I think the SEC is going to put some requirements out as to who is qualified to sign off on a reserves report from a filing company. There are no requirements whatsoever other than good sense. And I don't think this means that you have to be a licensed engineer, a licensed geologist, but I think you'll see in the new guidelines, you'll see some guidance as to some qualifications that the person who signs off needs to meet. Excuse me, I need to move along. What's happening now? SPE is working with the International Accounting Standards Board. You probably don't know who they are. You likely don't care, but we'll talk about that in just a little bit. We're working with the United Nations. You'll say, why are we doing that? Well, again, many of us don't have hands-on connection with the United Nations. What we know about them is something we don't like sometimes. But they are establishing, though, some global guidelines to populate their framework classification system. And SPE needs to be a part of that. We need to be right in the center of that. Matter of fact, there's a memorandum of understanding between SPE and the United Nations framework classification to do this. How much sleep will you lose over this at night? Probably not much, but it's ongoing. And I do think it's important, not to practitioners, but it's important for SPE to maintain the standards. Who else in the world would you go to develop reserves and resource standards, if not the SPE? So we can't dare not lose out on that opportunity. Also, there's the Oil and Gas Committee has issued a simplified version of PRMS that can be used. We kind of call it inside PRMS for Dummies. Don't tell people I said that. But it is a simplified version for your management. I'll say that. But it's clarified a lot, and I think it's a good piece of work. I think it's helpful for use in the United Nations and some of the things outside our circle of people who use the same lingo. We are working with some of the mining constituencies to help come together a little bit on definitional terms. We came out of a mining society, as many of you know, out of the American Institute of Mining and Metallurgical Engineers, but we still need, for some global purposes, I believe, and others believe, when the SPE Board, that we harmonize a little bit about some of the terms that we use between the mining and the petroleum profession. And this term competent person keeps popping up in some of these other places, and that may go back to some of the same things that SEC is looking for as to what comprises who is a competent person. More about the IASB. It's an International Accounting Standards Board that operates somewhat like our own U.S. Financial Accounting Standards Board. I'll not read the slides to you, but it includes a number of countries, including the U.S., so that we can have consistent financial standards around the world, so that the UK doesn't have its own, Australia has its own, Norway has its own, and others. At least unify some of those things. IASB has signed more than 100 countries now to work with them. These are small countries that just had no representation in the global capital market at all. But this all harmonizes it back around, coming back to the SEC. I'll let you read what the purpose of the IASB is to develop a single set of high-quality standards. It's important for those folks to do that. It's important to us as shareholders in companies, and not just in the U.S., to ensure that we have the same reporting standards globally, and to some of the small entities and emerging economies. With things that are happening on Wall Street almost as we speak, we do need to bring more comfort to reporting requirements so that we understand a little bit better about where capital markets really are. I grew up on Campbell's soup and I used to play with the alphabets, but the acronyms. I went to Geneva about 3 years ago to one of the first meetings we had, SPE and the other people there. Look at all these acronyms. You'll know some of them. Mark Rubin went along on that trip. John Ritter was there, and I was there to kind of at least initialize with some of these other countries. These are the different countries that were represented there while we were there in trying to understand their needs and our needs, and for Rubin particularly, Mark Rubin particularly, to express SPE's views that we're happy to work with you, but we're not going to be politicized by this. These definitions have been written for our SPE members. We're happy for you to use what you want to of these, but we're not of a mind to start modifying our technical resource definitions to accommodate political purposes of the SPE. So I don't worry about those things, but it's still a process we have to go through in working with all these different countries. China was not present, but they are participating. When you're sitting around a room with people with OPEC and others, they all say, yes, we want to come together. Well, this was 3 years ago, and we're not there yet. And this may last many more years as we try to bring all these countries to a common code. But we're still pointing toward using the SPE code, which will probably change again before it gets adopted at the level at the United Nations. Excuse me, went the wrong way with this mouse. The United Nations Framework Classification Cube. How many of you are familiar with this? Okay. How many of you like it? Uh-oh. Okay. It's a little bit like the Rubik's Cube, and once you solve the Rubik's Cube, you kind of like it. So I think we need a little bit of work on this. This is a three-dimensional version of the resource chart that I showed to you. It's a lot more granularity, and it may serve more purposes for some people. People I associate with, we still argue about the two-dimensional version of this. So I'll not try to put any personal aspersions to this or not, but it is useful for some people in some areas. You'll see that the reserves, if you take that, what I'm showing there on the left, the two-dimensional part, when it's exploded, if I'll call it that, into the three-dimensional part, you can see the three little boxes for proved, probable, and possible reserves. You can see all these boxes for contingent resources. You see one little box for prospective resources. This may get modified over time. I don't think it's necessarily important for us to understand this here, but it's more of an awareness of where SPE is and what's going on out of our sight from time to time. We have a number of volunteers within SPE who travel to Geneva at their own expense to have these semi-annual meetings. It is worthwhile, and I think the SPE is to be applauded in carrying the ball on this. But this is underway. Where we seem to be going, we will have a strong influence on both the United Nations and the IASB, but will not be politically motivated. I can't say that. I'm not a board member, but I just know that our board and our executive director are committed to that. The IASB will have a strong influence on our own SEC and convergence. They said at one time 2009. Now it looks like 2011, but I think it will happen, and I think it will be a good thing and SPE definition will be right at the heart of it. And in conclusion, SPE will continue to be the global standard setter, as it should be, and will be adopted by major regulatory agencies worldwide, as it seems to be being adopted almost as we speak by our own dearly beloved SEC. They may choose the parts that they like better, but it will still be the guidelines for that. And with that, Jim, I will, this doesn't always work the same way. Thank you for listening and for your patience.